The morning fog clung to Cedar Valley like a burial shroud as Rebecca Thompson stood outside the courthouse, her calloused hands clutching a manila folder containing every cent she had managed to scrape together. The weight of 4 generations of farming history pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any harvest load she'd ever carried. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp autumn air, while the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded her of wheat fields ready for harvest. Fields she might never work again if the next hour went as badly as she feared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca smoothed down her best dress, the navy blue one she'd worn to her husband Daniel's funeral 3 years ago, and tried to ignore the trembling in her hands. Inside that folder was $42,000 in cash and certified checks, representing every sacrifice she'd made since the bank had started foreclosure proceedings 6 months ago. Sophie's college fund emptied, the truck sold to their neighbor for half its worth. Even her wedding ring pawned, leaving a pale band of skin on her finger like a ghost of happier times. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than usual as she climbed them, each footfall echoing with finality. Other farmers from Cedar Valley had gathered in small clusters near the entrance, their faces etched with the same worry lines that had become permanent fixtures on her own face. Emma Carter broke away from the group and hurried toward her, her red hair catching the morning light like a flame of solidarity. "Becca, honey, you shouldn't have to do this alone," Emma said, wrapping an arm around Rebecca's shoulders. The familiar scent of hay and lavender from Emma's goat farm provided a moment of comfort in the sterile courthouse atmosphere. "I'm not alone," Rebecca replied, managing a weak smile. "Half the valley's here. Besides, Sophie's at school. That's where she needs to be, not watching her mother lose everything her great-grandfather built." The heavy oak doors swung open with a groan that seemed to echo the collective despair of the farming community. Inside, the auction hall had been transformed from its usual mundane municipal purpose into what felt like an execution chamber. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where the auctioneer's podium stood like a judge's bench ready to pronounce sentence. Rebecca's stomach churned as she recognized the suited figures already seated in the front rows. Marcus Blackwood sat at the center of his entourage like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit probably worth more than most farmers in the room made in a month. The CEO of Valley Springs Development Corporation had the satisfied expression of a predator who knew his prey was already cornered. To his right sat Judge William Hartley, supposedly here in an unofficial capacity, though everyone knew his presence was meant to add weight to the proceedings. The judge's connection to Blackwood's company had been the subject of whispered conversations at Rosa's diner for months. But in a small town like Cedar Valley, proving corruption was as difficult as growing corn in concrete. Rebecca found a seat near the back, Emma settling beside her with protective determination. Around them, the room filled with familiar faces. Tom and Martha Henley, whose dairy farm had been in operation since 1938. The Yamamoto family, third-generation strawberry farmers who had turned their small plot into the region's most successful U-pick operation. Old Pete Morrison, whose face bore the deep lines of 7 decades spent under the Idaho sun. "They're all here for you," Emma whispered, squeezing Rebecca's hand. "We won't let Blackwood take Thompson Farm without a fight." The auctioneer, Harold Winston, took his position at the podium with the reluctant air of a man who knew he was about to participate in something fundamentally wrong. Harold had been running estate auctions in Cedar Valley for 30 years, but the foreclosure sales of the past 18 months had aged him visibly. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold began, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "We'll begin this morning with lot number 14, the Thompson Farm property, 120 acres of prime agricultural land with water rights, main residence, and various outbuildings." Rebecca's throat tightened as aerial photographs of her home appeared on the screen behind Harold. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch where Sophie had taken her first steps. The red barn that still bore the faded logo of Thompson Seeds. And feed from when Daniel's grandfather had run a side business during the Depression, the apple orchard where she and Daniel had exchanged their first kiss as teenagers. The property includes senior water rights dating to 1952, Harold continued, his voice mechanical as he read from his notes. Current zoning is agricultural, though interested parties should note the recent County Planning Commission's openness to mixed-use development proposals. A bitter taste filled Rebecca's mouth. Everyone knew the Planning Commission's sudden flexibility coincided with substantial campaign contributions from Valley Springs Development to several county commissioners. The same commissioners who had voted against drought relief measures that might have helped farmers like her stay afloat. "We'll open bidding at $300,000, Harold announced. Rebecca's heart sank. The opening bid alone was more than 7 times what she had managed to gather. She watched helplessly as paddles rose around the room, though she noticed with grim satisfaction that none belonged to local residents. The bidders were all outsiders, representatives of development companies and investment firms, drawn by the promise of cheap land in a region increasingly desperate for economic opportunity. 300,000 to the gentleman in the grey. His suit, Harold acknowledged. "Do I hear 325? Marcus Blackwood raised his paddle with casual indifference, as though the amount meant nothing more to him than pocket change, which Rebecca realized bitterly it probably was. Valley Springs Development had resources that dwarfed anything the farming community could muster. 325 to Mr. Blackwood. 350? The bidding continued its relentless climb. 400,000, 450, 500. With each increase, Rebecca felt another piece of her life being carved away. She thought of Sophie's face that morning, trying to be brave as she hugged her mother goodbye. "It'll be okay, Mom," her daughter had said, though her eyes had betrayed her fear. "We're Thompsons. We always find a way." At 650,000, most of the other bidders dropped out, leaving only Blackwood and a representative from a company called Pinnacle Land Holdings. Rebecca recognized the woman as someone who had been spotted surveying several farms in the valley over the past month, always accompanied by geological survey equipment that seemed odd for simple property assessment. 700,000, Blackwood stated, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. The Pinnacle representative hesitated, consulting with someone on her phone before shaking her head. Harold looked around the room once more, his gaze lingering on Rebecca with something that might have been sympathy or shame. 700,000 going once, he said slowly. Rebecca stood up, her legs shaking but her voice surprisingly steady. "I have $42,000, she announced, holding up her folder. "It's everything I have, everything I could borrow or sell. I know it's not enough by your standards, but this isn't just property to me. This is my daughter's heritage. This is 4 generations of Thompson's sweat and dreams." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Several farmers nodded in understanding, while Blackwood's associates exchanged amused glances. Judge Hartley leaned over to whisper something to Blackwood, who smiled coldly. "Ma'am," Harold said gently, "I appreciate your situation, but this is a formal auction. Bids must exceed the current offer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I understand the rules. Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for recognition that some things have value beyond money. My great-grandfather cleared this land with nothing but an axe and determination. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl years when everyone said farming in Idaho was finished. My father innovated irrigation techniques that are still used throughout the valley. My husband died working those fields, and I've spent 3 years proving a widow can run a farm as well as any man." Emma stood up beside her, followed by Tom Henley, then the Yamamotos. One by one, farmers throughout the room rose to their feet in silent support. Even some of the townspeople who weren't farmers stood, including Rosa Valdez from the diner and Jim Patterson from the hardware store. Blackwood's expression darkened. "This is highly irregular," he said, turning to Harold. "Are you going to maintain order, or should we call Sheriff Bradley?" "Please everyone be seated," Harold said weakly. "We need to proceed with the auction according to legal requirements." Rebecca remained standing. "Mr. Blackwood, I know what your company really wants. It's not the farmland, it's what's beneath it. The geological surveys, the mineral rights assessments. Did you think we wouldn't notice? This isn't about development, it's about extraction." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "You're out of order, Mrs. Thompson. Your conspiracy theories have no place in these proceedings. 700,000 going twice," Harold continued reluctantly. Rebecca felt tears burning her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of Blackwood and his vultures. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, but it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough against the kind of money and influence Blackwood commanded. Just as Harold raised his gavel for the final call, a sound cut through the tension like a blade. The distinctive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter rotors grew louder, rattling the courthouse windows. Through the tall windows, everyone could see a state police helicopter descending onto the courthouse lawn, its official markings gleaming in the morning sun. The auction hall erupted in confused murmurs as the helicopter touched down. The door opened, and out stepped a figure that made everyone in the room freeze in recognition. Governor Patricia Lawson, dressed in a crisp blue suit, strode across the lawn with the purposeful gait of someone on a mission. Behind her followed James Mitchell, her chief of staff, and 2 state troopers. "What in the hell?" Blackwood muttered, his composure cracking for the first time. Harold lowered his gavel without completing the sale, his eyes fixed on the courthouse. Entrance. The heavy doors swung open, and Governor Lawson entered, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance," the governor said, her voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "Harold, I'm going to have to ask you to pause these proceedings. We have new information that's relevant to this sale." Judge Hartley stood up, his face reddening. "Governor Lawson, with all due respect, this is a county matter. The state has no jurisdiction over local property auctions." Governor Lawson's smile was sharp as a winter morning. "Actually, Judge Hartley, when those property auctions involve potential violation of state water rights, environmental protection laws, and what our investigation suggests may be systematic fraud, it becomes very much a state matter." Rebecca sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Emma grabbed her hand, both women watching in amazement as the state's highest elected official walked directly toward them. "Mrs. Thompson?" the governor asked, stopping in front of Rebecca. "I'm Patricia Lawson. I believe we need to have a conversation about your farm and about some information that's recently come to light regarding Valley Springs Development Corporation's activities in Cedar Valley." Blackwood was on his feet now, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. "Governor, I don't know what kind of political stunt this is, but we have followed all proper procedures. This auction is legitimate." "Is it?" Governor Lawson turned to face him, her expression hardening. Then perhaps you can explain why Valley Springs Development has been conducting unauthorized drilling tests on properties adjacent to foreclosed farms, or why your company's subsidiary, Pinnacle Land Holdings, has been filing mineral rights claims on state land that borders these properties. The color drained from Blackwood's face. Around the room, farmers exchanged knowing looks. They had suspected something beyond simple development was driving the aggressive land acquisitions, but having their suspicions confirmed by the governor herself was staggering. Furthermore, the governor continued, we've discovered some interesting connections between certain county officials and your company's board of directors. Judge Hartley, for instance, whose wife serves as a paid consultant for Valley Springs, or the 3 county commissioners who voted to expedite foreclosure proceedings after receiving substantial campaign contributions from your political action committee. Judge Hartley stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to these accusations. This is defamation. No, Judge, this is the beginning of a formal state investigation, Governor Lawson replied coolly. She turned back to Rebecca, her expression softening. Mrs. Thompson, I understand you've been fighting to save your family's farm. I'd like to show you something. James Mitchell stepped forward with a tablet, which the governor took and handed to Rebecca. On the screen was a photograph of a much younger Patricia Lawson standing next to an older woman in front of a modest farmhouse. Rebecca's breath caught as she recognized the building in the background. That's our north pasture, Rebecca said slowly. But how? My mother, Grace Lawson, worked as a teacher in Cedar Valley 40 years ago, the governor explained. She boarded with your husband's grandmother during her first year here. Your family's kindness to a young woman far from home made a profound impression on her. She often spoke of the Thompsons and how they embodied everything good about farming communities. Rebecca stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process this unexpected connection. Mrs. Henderson used to talk about a young teacher who stayed with them. She said she was like the daughter they never had. When I saw the report about today's auction, about another family farm being lost to questionable foreclosure proceedings, I couldn't ignore it. Then my staff discovered the pattern of acquisitions, the geological surveys, the mineral rights filings. This isn't just about your farm, Mrs. Thompson. It's about the systematic targeting of an entire community for its underground resources. Blackwood's lawyer stepped forward. Governor, these are serious allegations without any provided evidence. My client has operated entirely within the law. Has he? Governor Lawson smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. Then I'm sure Mr. Blackwood won't mind the full audit of Valley Springs Development's financial records that's beginning as we speak, or the environmental impact assessment of those unauthorized drilling sites, or the investigation into what appears to be coordinated manipulation of property assessments to trigger foreclosures. The auction hall had become utterly silent, except for the scratch of reporters' pens. Several had appeared as if from nowhere, drawn by the governor's unexpected arrival. Tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. Harold, the governor addressed the auctioneer, I'm issuing an executive order suspending all foreclosure auctions in Cedar Valley pending the completion of our investigation. Mrs. Thompson's farm and every other property scheduled for forced sale will remain with their current owners until we can determine whether any laws were broken in the foreclosure process. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion at this unexpected reprieve. Sophie would have her home. The legacy her family had built wouldn't be destroyed for the sake of hidden mineral wealth. Blackwood gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and threatening. You can't stop progress forever. No, Mr. Blackwood, Governor Lawson replied. But I can stop corruption, and I will. She turned back to the assembled farmers, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. To the people of Cedar Valley, I want you to know that your state government hasn't forgotten you. Rural communities are the backbone of Idaho, and we won't stand by while they're dismantled for profit. As Blackwood and his entourage stormed out, followed by a very pale Judge Hartley, the auction hall erupted in applause. Farmers who had arrived expecting to witness another community tragedy found themselves part of something entirely different. A moment when justice arrived, not a moment too late, when the powerful were held accountable, and when the sacrifices of ordinary people were finally recognized. Governor Lawson sat down beside Rebecca, her official demeanor melting into something more personal. My mother passed away last year, she said quietly, but she never forgot the kindness your family showed her. She used to say that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the communities we build and the legacies we leave. Your great-grandfather understood that. Your husband understood it. And from what I've seen today, you understand it too. Rebecca wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Then don't say it, the governor replied. Just keep farming. Keep being the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when the odds are impossible. And maybe consider running for county commissioner in the next election. Cedar Valley could use more leaders who understand what really matters. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to shake Rebecca's hand or offer congratulations, Emma helped her friend to her feet. You did it, Becca. You saved the farm. Rebecca shook her head, still dazed. I didn't do anything. If Governor Lawson hadn't arrived. But she did arrive, Emma insisted, because you stood up, because you refused to go quietly, because sometimes when you fight for what's right, the universe finds a way to help. Outside, the state helicopter sat on the courthouse lawn like a modern-day cavalry horse, its presence a reminder that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Rebecca thought of Sophie, sitting in her classroom, probably worried sick about what was happening. She couldn't wait to tell her daughter that they were keeping their home, that the Thompson legacy would continue for at least another generation. Governor Lawson joined them at the courthouse steps, her security detail maintaining a respectful distance. There will be investigations, she warned. Blackwood has resources and connections. This isn't over. I know, Rebecca said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice, but we're not alone anymore, and that makes all the difference. As they stood there in the morning sunlight, the fog that had shrouded Cedar Valley at dawn had lifted completely, revealing the rich farmland stretching to the horizon. The same land that had sustained generations of families like the Thompsons, land that held secrets more valuable than gold to men like Blackwood, but whose true worth lay in the communities it nourished and the dreams it made possible. The helicopters. Rotors began to spin again as Governor Lawson prepared to depart. I'll be back, she promised Rebecca, for the investigation and to see how you're doing. My mother would have wanted that. As the helicopter lifted off, Rebecca turned to look at the farmers and townspeople still gathered around the courthouse. Their faces reflected a mixture of relief, hope, and renewed determination. The battle for Cedar Valley's soul was far from over, but today, against all odds, the community had won a crucial victory. Come on, Emma said, linking her arm through Rebecca's. Let's go tell Sophie the good news, and then we need to call a community meeting. If Blackwood thinks this is over, he's got another thing coming. Rebecca nodded, a smile finally breaking through her tears. The Thompson farm would face another sunrise, another season of planting and harvest, and with the truth about Valley, Spring's development schemes now exposed, maybe other farming communities would find the strength to fight back too. The morning that had begun with the threat of losing everything had transformed into something else entirely. A new beginning, not just for one family, but for an entire valley that had rediscovered its voice and its power to shape its own destiny. The Cedar Valley Community Center hadn't seen this many people gathered since the annual Harvest Festival 5 years ago, before the drought started and the foreclosures began. Metal folding chairs scraped against the worn wooden floor as farmers, shop owners, and concerned citizens filed in, their faces a mixture of hope and wariness following the morning's dramatic courthouse events. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that emphasized the worry lines etched into weathered faces. Rebecca Thompson stood near the front of the room, still wearing her navy dress from the auction, but now with mud-stained boots hastily pulled on for the walk across the courthouse lawn. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of coffee from Rosa Valdez, the warm ceramic a welcome anchor in the surreal aftermath of the governor's intervention. "Drink up, mija," Rosa said softly, her motherly concern evident. "You look like you're about to fall over, and we need you strong for what's coming." Emma Carter had taken charge of organizing the impromptu meeting, her natural leadership skills emerging as she directed people to seats and ensured everyone had a copy of the preliminary documents the governor's office had shared. The papers detailed the scope of the state investigation into Valley Springs Development Corporation, and the evidence was damning even in its initial form. "Folks, let's get started," Emma called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "We all saw what happened at the courthouse this morning. Governor Lawson's intervention has bought us time, but we need to understand exactly what we're facing." Tom Henley, whose dairy farm bordered Rebecca's property to the east, stood up slowly. At 73, he was one of the oldest active farmers in the valley, and his words carried the weight of decades of experience. "Been farming this land for 57 years, he began, his voice gravelly with emotion. "Seen plenty of hard times, but this is different. This isn't about weather or market prices. This is about folks with deep pockets trying to steal what our families built." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah Yamamoto raised her hand. "The governor mentioned unauthorized drilling tests. We've had strange vehicles on the edges of our property for months. Thought they were surveyors for the proposed highway expansion." Rebecca stepped forward, finding her voice despite the emotional exhaustion of the day. "According to the documents Governor Lawson's team provided, Valley Springs Development has been conducting geological surveys throughout the valley for the past 18 months. They've identified significant mineral deposits, particularly lithium and rare earth elements used in technology manufacturing." A collective intake of breath echoed through the room. Lithium mining had transformed parts of Nevada and Oregon, bringing wealth but also environmental destruction. The implications for Cedar Valley's agricultural heritage were staggering. Michael Patterson, who ran the local hardware store, leaned forward in his chair. "So they've been forcing foreclosures to get at these minerals. How is that even legal?" "It's not," Emma replied firmly. "At least not the way they've been doing it. The governor's investigation has already uncovered evidence of manipulated property assessments, coordinated loan term changes, and what appears to be collusion between Valley Springs Development and certain county officials." Judge William Hartley's name went unspoken but hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew about his wife's consulting contract with Valley Springs, about the favorable rulings that had accelerated foreclosure proceedings, about the zoning changes that had made agricultural land vulnerable to development. "What I don't understand," said Janet Morrison, old Pete's daughter-in-law, "is how they kept this hidden for so long. Mineral exploration isn't exactly subtle." Rebecca consulted the documents in her hand. They used shell companies and conducted most of the testing at night or on weekends. The equipment was disguised as agricultural assessment tools, and they specifically targeted properties owned by elderly farmers or families facing financial difficulties, counting on us being too overwhelmed to investigate. The room fell silent as the systematic nature of the exploitation sank in. This wasn't random misfortune or the natural evolution of land use. This was a calculated campaign to dispossess an entire community. "My grandfather lost his farm in 1989, said Roberto Chavez, whose family now ran a small orchard on leased land. "Different company, same tactics. They promised jobs, economic development. 20 families lost their homes. The development never happened. The land was sold to an industrial farming consortium 6 months later. The pattern was heartbreakingly familiar. Promises of progress used to justify the destruction of communities, with the real profits flowing to distant boardrooms while local families scattered like chaff in the wind." Sheriff Tom Bradley entered the community center, his uniform crisp but his expression troubled. The room tensed at his arrival. Bradley had walked a careful line during the mounting foreclosure crisis, enforcing court orders while expressing personal sympathy for the affected families. His presence at this gathering would be noted by Blackwood's allies. "Afternoon, folks," Bradley said, removing his hat. "Thought you should know there's been some interesting activity since this morning's events. Marcus Blackwood has retained additional legal counsel from Boise. Judge Hartley has recused himself from all pending foreclosure cases, citing potential appearances of impropriety. And I've had 3 calls from the State Attorney General's office requesting all documentation related to property transfers in Cedar Valley over the past 2 years. The sheriff's willingness to share this information spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay when forced to choose between his community and the political pressures of his position." Emma gestured to an empty chair. "Join us, Tom. This concerns everyone who calls Cedar Valley home." Bradley sat down heavily, looking older than his 55 years. "I've been sheriff here for 12 years. Thought I was doing right by enforcing the law equally. But if what the governor's saying is true, I've been helping thieves in 3-piece suits rob our neighbors blind." "You didn't know," Rebecca said gently. "None of us saw the full picture until today." "Maybe we didn't want to see it, Tom," Henley interjected, too focused on our own troubles to notice the pattern. "Divide and conquer, oldest trick in the book." Rosa Valdez stood up, her diminutive stature belied by the force of her personality. "Enough looking backward. What matters now is what we do next. The governor has given us a reprieve, not a solution. Blackwood and his cronies won't give up easily." "Rosa's right," Emma agreed. "We need to organize, form a legal defense fund, document everything. The state investigation will help, but we can't be passive observers in our own fate." Rebecca felt a surge of determination replacing the morning's despair. "We need to catalog every interaction with Valley Springs development, every unusual visitor to our properties, every pressure tactic used by the bank. Create a timeline that shows the coordination between the foreclosures and the mineral exploration." "I can help with that," offered Dr. James Winters, who had retired to Cedar Valley 5 years ago after a career as a corporate attorney in Seattle. "Still have some contacts in environmental law. This kind of resource exploitation often violates federal regulations as well as state laws." The meeting continued for 3 hours, transforming from a gathering of shell-shocked victims into a coordinated resistance movement. Committees were formed: legal research, documentation, community outreach, media relations. The farmers and townspeople of Cedar Valley had faced droughts, floods, and market crashes. They knew how to weather storms, and this storm, though man-made, would be no different. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Rebecca of her favorite time of day on the farm, she found herself standing outside the community center with Emma and Sheriff Bradley. The air had turned cool, carrying the scent of approaching autumn and the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney. "You know Blackwood won't take this lying down," Bradley said quietly. "Men like him don't get where they are by accepting defeat gracefully." "Let him come," Emma replied with steel in her voice. "We're not isolated anymore. The whole state is watching now. Maybe the whole country if we play this right." Rebecca thought about Sophie, who would be getting home from school soon, probably worried sick about the auction results. "I need to go tell my daughter we're keeping our home," she said. "At least for now." "For good," Emma corrected firmly. "We're going to win this, Becca. All of us together." Doom, as Rebecca drove her battered pickup truck down the familiar roads toward Thompson Farm, she noticed things she'd been too stressed to see for months. The way the evening light turned the wheat fields to gold, the majesty of the mountains rising, in the distance, the small beauties that made this valley worth fighting for. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She pulled over to read it, her heart stopping for a moment at the message. "This isn't over. Some fights are too big for small people. Be careful. A friend." A chill ran down her spine, but she deleted the message and continued driving. Intimidation was just another tactic, and she was done being afraid. The morning had proven that even small people could attract powerful allies when their cause was just. As she turned into her driveway, she saw Sophie sitting on the porch steps, still in her school uniform, her face a mixture of hope and fear. Rebecca parked and stepped out, spreading her arms wide. "We're staying, baby!" she called out. "We're staying!" Sophie flew down the steps and into her mother's arms, both of them crying now, but these were tears of joy and relief. Over her daughter's shoulder, Rebecca could see the fields stretching toward the horizon, the same fields her great-grandfather had first plowed, the same soil that had nourished 4 generations of Thompsons. "How?" Sophie asked, pulling back to look at her mother's face. "What happened?" "It's a long story," Rebecca said, smoothing her daughter's hair. "But the short version is that sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, unexpected help arrives, and sometimes that help comes in a helicopter." They walked toward the house together, arms around each other's waists. There would be more. Battles ahead, Rebecca knew. Legal challenges, political maneuvering, perhaps even dirty tricks from Blackwood and his associates. But today had proven that their community wasn't as powerless as they'd believed. They had truth on their side, and now they had powerful allies. Inside the farmhouse, Rebecca made dinner while Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table, the same table where generations of Thompsons had shared meals and made decisions about planting and harvesting. The familiar routine felt precious, now no longer taken for granted. "Mom," Sophie said suddenly, looking up from her math problems, "were you scared this morning?" Rebecca considered lying, providing the brave front she'd maintained for so long. But the day's events had taught her something about the power of truth. "Terrified," she admitted. "I thought we were going to lose everything. But you went anyway. You stood up in front of all those people." "Sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared," Rebecca said, echoing words her own father had once told her. "It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Sophie nodded solemnly, wisdom beyond her 12 years showing in her eyes, like great-great-grandpa clearing the land when everyone said it was too rocky to farm. Exactly like that. As they ate dinner, Rebecca's phone rang repeatedly. Reporters wanting statements, neighbors checking in, even a call from someone claiming to represent a documentary film crew interested in their story. She let them all go to voicemail. Tonight was for family, for processing the day's extraordinary events, for preparing for whatever came next. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rebecca sat on the porch in the old rocking chair that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. The night was clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She could hear the familiar sounds of the farm, settling in for the night, the distant lowing of cattle from the Henley Ranch, the rustle of wind through the wheat, the chirping of crickets. A car's headlights appeared on the county road, slowing as it approached her driveway. Rebecca tensed, wondering if Blackwood had decided to pay a personal visit. But the vehicle that turned in was Emma's hybrid, its quiet engine barely disturbing the evening peace. Emma climbed out, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need some company," she said, climbing the porch steps. "And maybe something stronger than coffee." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the stars appear one by one. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now, too dramatic to be real. But the executive order from the governor's office, a copy of which sat on Rebecca's kitchen counter, was tangible proof that their reprieve was real. "Do you think Blackwood knew," Emma asked eventually, "about your husband's grandmother taking in the governor's mother all those years ago?" Rebecca shook her head. "How could he? I didn't even know until today. It's just, I don't know, fate, karma, dumb luck?" "Maybe it's simpler than that," Emma suggested. "Maybe it's just proof that kindness creates ripples we can't always see. Your family's generosity 40 years ago came back when you needed it most." They talked late into the night, planning strategies for the legal battles ahead, sharing memories of better times, allowing themselves to hope for the first time in months. When Emma finally left, Rebecca remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool night air. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Governor Lawson herself. "Hope you and Sophie are resting well. The real work begins. Tomorrow, my investigative team will be in Cedar Valley by noon. We're going to expose every detail of Blackwood's scheme. My mother used to say the Thompsons were the kind of people who made America great. Time to prove her right. Patricia." Rebecca smiled, typing back a simple response. "We'll be ready. Thank you for remembering us. Rebecca." As she stood to go inside, she noticed lights still burning in several farmhouses across the valley. Her neighbors were awake too, probably having similar conversations, making similar plans. They had been isolated in their individual struggles for too long. Now they were united, and that unity, combined with the unexpected support from the state capital, might just be enough to save not only their farms, but their entire way of life. The next morning would bring new challenges. Blackwood's lawyers would file motions. Political pressure would be applied. The media attention would intensify. But tonight, Cedar Valley slept a little easier, knowing that sometimes, against all odds, David really could defeat Goliath. Rebecca took one last look at her fields before heading inside. Tomorrow, she would meet with investigators, provide evidence, continue the fight. But she would do so knowing that Thompson Farm would see another planting season, another harvest. The legacy her ancestors had built would endure. In the distance, coyotes howled, their wild song echoing across the valley. It was a sound as old as the land itself, a reminder that some things endured despite all attempts to tame or destroy them. Like the farming community of Cedar Valley, like the Thompson family spirit. Like the truth that had finally found its voice. The porch light clicked off as Rebecca went inside, but the stars continued to shine overhead, bearing witness to the quiet revolution that had begun in a small courthouse in Idaho and would ripple outward in ways no one could yet imagine. Sometimes, the most profound changes started in the most unexpected places, with ordinary people refusing to surrender to extraordinary pressure. As Cedar Valley settled into sleep, the night wind carried the scent of approaching rain. The drought might be ending, and with it perhaps the season of loss that had gripped the farming community for too long. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but also new possibilities. For the first time in months, hope felt stronger than fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thompson farmyard as 3 unmarked sedans and a mobile command unit rolled up the gravel driveway. Rebecca stood on her porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the procession with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Sophie had already left for school, sparing her the intensity of what was about to unfold. Special Investigator Maria Gonzalez stepped out of the lead vehicle, her crisp grey suit and confident bearing immediately marking her as someone accustomed to authority. Behind her, a team of forensic accountants, environmental scientists, and legal analysts emerged, each carrying equipment cases and document boxes. "Mrs. Thompson?" Gonzalez approached with an extended hand. "I'm Maria Gonzalez, leading the state's investigation into Valley Springs development. Governor Lawson asked me to personally oversee this case." Rebecca shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Thank you for coming. I've gathered all the documents I could find relating to our foreclosure proceedings and the unusual activity around the farm." "Excellent. We'll need to establish a temporary base of operations. Would your barn be suitable? We need space to spread out documents and set up our equipment." Within an hour, the Thompson barn had been transformed into an investigation headquarters. Laptops glowed on makeshift tables. A large topographical map of Cedar Valley covered one wall, and boxes of subpoenaed documents from Greenfield Regional Bank were being systematically catalogued. Emma Carter arrived as the team was setting up, followed by Tom Henley and several other farmers who had volunteered to provide testimony. The barn that had once stored hay and housed dairy cows now buzzed with the energy of people determined to uncover the truth. "Let's start with the timeline," Gonzalez addressed the gathered farmers. "When did you first notice unusual activity that might be related to mineral exploration?" Tom Henley scratched his weathered jaw thoughtfully. "About 2 years ago, maybe a bit more. Started seeing surveying crews on the county roads at odd hours. They said they were updating maps for the state highway department." "I have photos," Sarah Yamamoto interjected, producing her phone. "My son likes to document everything. Here's one from 14 months ago showing drilling equipment near our eastern boundary. They were gone by morning." Gonzalez's team quickly began cross-referencing the farmers' observations with official records. A pattern emerged on the wall-mounted map as red pins marked each reported incident. The drilling sites formed a clear grid pattern across the valley, focusing on areas that corresponded with the richest agricultural land. "These aren't random tests," Dr. Patricia Wong, the team's geological expert, observed. "This is systematic mineral exploration following standard industry protocols." They knew exactly what they were looking for. Rebecca pulled out a folder she'd kept hidden in her kitchen drawer. 3 months before my husband died, he received an offer from a company called Mountain West Resources. They wanted to lease our mineral rights for what seemed like a generous sum. Daniel refused. He said the land was for farming, not mining. Gonzalez examined the documents carefully. Mountain West Resources is a subsidiary of Pinnacle Holdings, which is owned by Valley Springs Development Corporation. They were already positioning themselves 3 years ago. The revelation sent a murmur through the assembled farmers. The conspiracy had deeper roots than anyone had imagined. "After Daniel died," Rebecca continued, her voice steady despite the emotion, "everything changed. The bank suddenly claimed our loan was in technical default due to a missed insurance payment. They refused to accept late payment and accelerated the entire loan. Within 6 months, we were facing foreclosure." "Same pattern here," Janet Morrison added. "Dad had farmed for 70 years, never missed a payment. Suddenly the bank said our property assessment had changed, requiring higher insurance coverage we couldn't afford. When we couldn't pay the increased premium, they called the loan." Investigator James Park, the team's financial crime specialist, looked up from his laptop. "I'm seeing suspicious patterns in the bank's internal communications. Emails discussing priority properties and acceleration targets, all marked with a special classification code that traces back to Valley Springs development." The morning wore on as more evidence accumulated. Environmental scientist Dr. Michael Torres returned from field testing with troubling news. I found trace contamination at 3 sites, all properties that experienced sudden well failures leading to livestock losses and crop damage. The contaminants are consistent with chemicals used in exploratory drilling. They poisoned our water. Tom Henley's face flushed with anger. Lost 30 head of cattle last summer. Vet couldn't explain it. Said it might be naturally occurring minerals. Nothing natural about it, Torres replied grimly. These chemicals are specifically used to break up rock formations during mineral exploration. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. By noon, the investigation had expanded beyond the barn. Teams of specialists spread across the valley, taking soil samples, interviewing residents, and documenting every piece of evidence. Sheriff Bradley arrived with boxes of records his department had compiled, his expression grim. Found something. You need to see, he told Gonzalez, producing a thick manila folder. Correspondence between Judge Hartley and Marcus Blackwood dating back 2 years. Discussions about streamlining the legal process and removing obstacles to progress. Hartley's wife received her consulting contract 1 week after the first favorable foreclosure ruling. The depth of corruption was staggering. Phone records showed regular communication between bank officials, county commissioners, and Valley Springs development executives. Financial records revealed a web of payments disguised as consulting fees, campaign contributions, and charitable donations. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the scale of what they were uncovering. She stepped outside for fresh air and found Maria Gonzalez studying the horizon where the mountains rose sharp against the autumn sky. "It's beautiful here," Gonzalez said without turning. "I grew up in farm country myself. Different crops, same values. My parents lost their farm to developers when I was in college. That's why I went into law." "Will it be enough?" Rebecca asked. "All this evidence. Blackwood has resources we can't match." Gonzalez turned, her expression fierce with determination. "He has money and connections. We have the truth and the law. In my experience, truth, properly presented, usually wins. Not always easily, not always quickly, but it wins." Inside the barn, a breakthrough was developing. Financial analyst Jennifer Chen had discovered a series of offshore transactions linking Valley Springs development to international mining consortiums. "They've already pre-sold mineral rights they don't legally own," she announced. "Contracts worth hundreds of millions, contingent on acquiring the land. This isn't just fraud, it's international securities violation." The implications were explosive. Valley Springs development had essentially sold futures on minerals still underground beneath family farms, creating enormous pressure to complete the land acquisitions by any means necessary. "That explains the urgency," Emma observed, "and the willingness to break laws. They have contractual deadlines to meet." As afternoon shadows lengthened, 2 more vehicles arrived at the farm. Rebecca recognized the first as belonging to Marcus Blackwood's lead attorney, Richard Sterling. The second carried 3 individuals in expensive suits who emerged with the careful movements of people unaccustomed to farm settings. Sterling approached the barn with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Ms. Gonzalez, I believe? I'm Richard Sterling, representing Valley Springs Development. We need to discuss the serious implications of this investigation on legitimate business operations." Gonzalez met him at the barn entrance, blocking his path with subtle authority. "Mr. Sterling, this is an active investigation site. Unless you have relevant evidence to provide, I'll have to ask you to leave." "My client has rights," Sterling persisted. "These allegations are damaging stock prices and harming corporate relationships. We demand access to whatever supposed evidence you're collecting. Your client's rights will be fully respected in court, Gonzalez replied coolly, where all evidence will be presented according to proper legal procedures. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. Sterling's companions stepped forward, one producing credentials. Agent Johnson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We understand this investigation may overlap with federal jurisdiction. We'd like to coordinate efforts. The arrival of federal agents shifted the dynamic entirely. Gonzalez welcomed their involvement, recognizing that the interstate nature of the fraud would require federal resources. Within minutes, the FBI team was integrated into the investigation, their presence adding another layer of authority to the proceedings. Rebecca watched from the farmhouse window as Sterling made heated phone calls from his car before driving away. The confident facade had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. Blackwood's empire was built on staying ahead of investigations, on controlling narratives and managing political pressure. But the combined force of state and federal investigators, backed by mounting evidence and public attention, was proving impossible to contain. As evening approached, Gonzalez gathered everyone in the barn for a preliminary assessment. The wall map was now covered with colored pins, strings connecting related incidents, and photographs documenting various violations. Financial charts showed the flow of money from international mining interests through offshore accounts to local officials. Environmental data revealed patterns of deliberate contamination designed to force property sales. What we have here, Gonzalez summarized, is evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving corporate executives, banking officials, and public servants. The scheme involves mail fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, and potentially RICO violations. We're looking at both civil and criminal penalties. The farmers listened with a mixture of vindication and sadness. Their suspicions had been confirmed, but the confirmation came with the bitter knowledge of how thoroughly their community had been betrayed by people they had trusted. What happens next? Rebecca asked. We continue gathering evidence, Gonzalez replied. Federal prosecutors will begin preparing indictments. The state will move to freeze all pending foreclosures and review every property transfer connected to Valley Springs development. Civil suits will likely follow, seeking damages for affected families. Dr. Wong added, the environmental damage alone will require extensive remediation. Valley Springs development will be liable for cleanup, costs that could reach tens of millions. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had revealed the true scope of what they were fighting, but also the resources now aligned on their side. The investigation teams began packing up for the day, though several agents would remain on site for security purposes. Emma walked with Rebecca back to the farmhouse as the sun set behind the mountains. Can you believe this morning? We were just hoping to document a few suspicious incidents. Now we're part of a federal investigation that could bring down a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I keep thinking about all the families who've already lost their farms, Rebecca replied. The Petersons, the Johnsons, the Nakamuras. Can they get their land back? That's tomorrow's fight, Emma said firmly. Today we've proven the fraud. Tomorrow we work on making victims whole. Sophie returned home from school to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and witness statements. The 12-year-old's eyes widened as she took in the serious atmosphere. Mom, what's happening? Rebecca pulled her daughter close. Remember when I told you that sometimes standing up for what's right attracts unexpected help? Well, that help is here, and it's bigger than we imagined. People from the state government, even the FBI, are working to expose what really happened to our farm and others like it. Are we going to be okay? Better than okay, sweetheart. We're going to get justice. That night, Cedar Valley buzzed with activity unusual for a farming community. Porch lights stayed on late as neighbors gathered to discuss the day's revelations. Phone lines hummed with conversations, spreading the news to distant relatives and former residents who had been forced to leave. Local reporters worked overtime, preparing stories that would make headlines across the state by morning. At the Cedar Valley Community Center, an emergency town council meeting convened. With Judge Hartley's recusal and 3 county commissioners under investigation, the remaining officials faced a community demanding answers and action. The usually passive attendance had swelled to standing room only, with farmers and townspeople united in their determination to reclaim their community's integrity. Marcus Blackwood sat in his Boise penthouse, watching news coverage of the investigation. With growing alarm, his empire, built carefully over 2 decades, was unraveling with stunning speed. Phone calls to political allies went unanswered. Board members distanced themselves. International partners demanded explanations for contracts that now appeared legally questionable. The anonymous text Rebecca had received the day before proved prophetic, but not in the way its sender had intended. The fight had indeed become too big for small people alone, which is precisely why it had attracted the attention of those with the power to ensure justice. Back at Thompson Farm, Rebecca stood once more on her porch, looking out over fields that would remain in her family's care. The stars were bright overhead, unmarred by city lights, watching over a valley that had found its voice and the courage to use it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Governor Lawson. "Saw the preliminary reports, more extensive than we imagined. You've helped expose something that goes far beyond Cedar Valley. Thank you for standing firm when it mattered most. Patricia." Rebecca typed back, "Just protecting what my family built. Thank you for remembering us when we needed it most. The real work is just beginning." Rebecca. As midnight approached, the last of the investigation vehicles departed the farm. The barn stood quiet now, but the evidence gathered within its walls would soon echo through courtrooms and corporate boardrooms across the country. The systematic targeting of rural communities for their hidden resources was no longer hidden. The truth, painstakingly documented and courageously revealed, would have its day. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying across fields that had been farmed for generations and would, thanks to the events set in motion this day, continue to be farmed for generations to come. Sometimes justice arrived not with the bang of a gavel, but with the quiet persistence of people refusing to be silenced, supported by those who remembered that power's highest purpose was to protect the vulnerable from the predatory. Cedar Valley slept fitfully that night, aware that morning would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. The investigation was just beginning, but already it had achieved something crucial. It had transformed a community of isolated victims into united citizens demanding accountability. That transformation, more than any legal victory, might prove to be the most lasting legacy of the day when truth came calling at Thompson Farm. 6 months after the investigation began at Thompson Farm, the federal courthouse in Boise witnessed a procession unlike anything in its history. Farmers in their best clothes, many wearing worn suits pulled from closets for weddings and funerals, filled the gallery alongside reporters from national outlets and legal observers from across the country. The case that had started with one woman's desperate stand against foreclosure had evolved into a landmark trial that would reshape corporate accountability in rural America. Rebecca Thompson sat in the front row, her daughter Sophie beside her, both wearing new dresses purchased for this momentous occasion. The simple navy outfit from the auction had been retired, replaced by professional attire that reflected her new role as lead plaintiff in the class action lawsuit against Valley Springs Development Corporation and its web of subsidiaries. The transformation in Rebecca went beyond clothing. Months of depositions, strategy meetings, and public speaking had refined her natural strength into polished leadership. She had become the face of a movement, though she still insisted she was just a farmer trying to protect her land. Marcus Blackwood entered the courtroom, flanked by a phalanx of attorneys, his silver hair now showing white at the temples, his face drawn from months of legal battles and corporate collapse. Valley Springs Development's stock price had plummeted, international partners had withdrawn, and several board members faced separate criminal charges. The empire built on exploiting rural communities was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen approached the witness stand first, her testimony methodically laying out the evidence gathered during the exhaustive investigation. Financial records appeared on courtroom monitors showing the flow of money from mining conglomerates through offshore accounts to local officials. Environmental data revealed deliberate contamination patterns. Communications between Blackwood and various conspirators painted a picture of calculated exploitation spanning years. The gallery listened in rapt attention as Chen detailed the scope of the conspiracy. 38 farms in Cedar Valley alone had been targeted. Similar patterns had been discovered in 6 other rural counties across 3 states. The total value of mineral rights illegally pursued exceeded $2 billion. When Blackwood's lead attorney, Richard Sterling, attempted to cross-examine, Chen's responses were precise and devastating. Each challenge to the evidence was met with additional documentation. Each attempt to minimize the conspiracy's scope revealed new connections. By the end of her testimony, the defense's strategy of claiming isolated incidents and rogue employees had evaporated. Dr. Patricia Wong took the stand next, her environmental impact assessment bringing several jury members to tears. Photos of contaminated wells, dead livestock, and ruined crops illustrated the human cost of the mineral exploration. Her detailed analysis showed how chemicals had been deliberately introduced into water systems to create crises that would force property sales. The third day of testimony brought a surprise witness. Thomas Harper, Valley Springs Development's former chief financial officer, had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. His insider's account revealed the full magnitude of the scheme, including Blackwood's personal involvement in every aspect of the conspiracy. Mr. Blackwood called it Project Harvest, Harper testified, his voice steady despite visible discomfort. The name was his joke. He said we were harvesting resources from people too simple to know what they were sitting on. Board meetings included discussions about which families were most vulnerable, who could be pressured through financial manipulation, which local officials could be bought. The prosecution presented Harper with internal company documents. Can you identify these emails? Yes. This chain shows Mr. Blackwood instructing me to transfer funds to Judge Hartley's wife's consulting firm 2 days before a crucial foreclosure ruling. This one details payments to county commissioners disguised as charitable donations. And this spreadsheet tracks mineral deposits beneath targeted properties with projected profit margins after acquisition. Rebecca watched Blackwood's face during this testimony. The confident corporate titan who had dominated the auction just months ago seemed to physically shrink as his former associate detailed the deliberate cruelty of their scheme. On the 4th day, Rebecca herself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she recounted her family's story, from her great-grandfather clearing the original land to her husband's death and the sudden acceleration of their loan. Her voice remained steady as she described the morning of the auction, the humiliation of offering her life savings, the moment when Governor Lawson's helicopter had changed everything. Mrs. Thompson, the prosecutor asked gently, what did losing the farm would have meant for your family? Rebecca looked directly at the jury. It wasn't just about property. That land holds 4 generations of our sweat, our dreams, our memories. My daughter learned to walk in the same yard where her great-great-grandfather built our first barn. When they tried to take our farm, they were trying to erase our history, our identity. And they were doing it to dozens of families, all for money we never knew existed beneath our feet. Sterling's cross-examination attempted to portray Rebecca as opportunistic, seeking financial gain from a legitimate business dispute. But Rebecca's dignity and straightforward answers only reinforced her credibility. When Sterling suggested she could have accepted buyout offers, she responded simply, "Some things aren't for sale at any price. My family's legacy is one of them." And deuce. The defense presented their case over 3 days, calling economist experts who testified about property rights and development benefits. They brought in industry specialists who argued that mineral exploration was standard practice. But each witness faced withering cross-examination that exposed their connections to Blackwood's network or revealed flaws in their arguments. The most dramatic moment came when Judge Harrison permitted the prosecution to present newly discovered evidence. An anonymous whistleblower had provided recordings of board meetings where Blackwood explicitly discussed the scheme. His voice, captured clearly, outlined strategies for corrupting local officials and manipulating foreclosure proceedings. "The beauty of it," Blackwood's recorded voice explained, "is that these farmers are too proud to ask for help and too isolated to compare notes. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll own the mineral rights to half the county. The lithium alone is worth 50 times what we're paying for the land." On the final day of testimony, character witnesses spoke for both sides. But while Blackwood's witnesses offered tepid endorsements of his business acumen, the farmers' witnesses painted vivid pictures of communities destroyed and families scattered. Emma Carter described finding her elderly neighbor, Pete Morrison, crying in his empty barn the day before vacating his foreclosed farm. Tom Henley recounted the suicides of 2 farmers who had lost everything. In closing arguments, the federal prosecutor wove together the threads of evidence into a damning narrative of corporate greed, systematically targeting vulnerable communities. The defense countered by arguing that aggressive business practices weren't illegal and that any violations were actions of overzealous employees. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with a verdict that sent shockwaves through corporate America. Guilty on all counts. Racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and violation of banking regulations. The criminal convictions were accompanied by civil judgments that would require Valley Springs Development to pay hundreds of millions in damages and remediation costs. But the legal victories extended beyond the courtroom. The case had prompted legislative action at both state and federal levels. New laws were passed protecting agricultural communities from predatory mineral exploration. Banking regulations were strengthened to prevent coordinated foreclosure schemes. Environmental standards were enhanced to criminalize deliberate contamination. Marcus Blackwood received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Several co-conspirators, including 3 bank executives and 2 county commissioners, received lesser sentences. Judge Hartley, who had pled guilty early in the proceedings, was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years. The remediation process began immediately. A court-appointed trustee oversaw the dissolution of Valley Springs Development's assets, with proceeds directed first to victim compensation. Families who had lost farms were given the opportunity to reclaim them at original sale prices, with the difference covered by the settlement fund. Environmental cleanup teams began the extensive work of removing contamination from affected properties. Cedar Valley experienced a renaissance as families returned and new agricultural initiatives took root. The Caldwell Agricultural Innovation Center, funded partly by the settlement, opened on land donated by the state. It focused on sustainable farming practices and helping small farms resist corporate pressure. Rebecca served on its board, balancing that responsibility with the daily work of running Thompson Farm, A year after the trial, Cedar Valley held its first harvest festival since the crisis began. Main Street overflowed with vendor booths and celebration. The Thompson farm booth, staffed by Rebecca and Sophie, sold organic produce and heritage seeds. Sophie, now 13 and more confident, explained sustainable farming practices to interested visitors. Governor Patricia Lawson attended as guest of honor, though she insisted the real honors belonged to the farmers who had fought to save their community. In her speech at the festival dinner, she reflected on the larger meaning of their victory. What happened here in Cedar Valley represents the best of American democracy, she told the gathered crowd. Citizens standing up against injustice, communities supporting each other through crisis, and the law ultimately serving its proper role of protecting the vulnerable from exploitation. This valley's courage has inspired similar movements across the country. Rural communities are no longer seen as easy targets, but as places where people will fight for their heritage. Rebecca found herself standing next to the governor as the evening wound down. They watched Sophie helping younger children with carnival games, her laughter bright in the warm evening air. "I never thanked you properly," Rebecca said quietly, "for remembering that connection between our families, for taking action when you could have stayed safely distant." Governor Lawson smiled. "My mother used to say that kindness creates circles that we can't always see, but that somehow complete themselves when most needed." Your family's generosity to a young teacher generations ago created a connection that helped save not just your farm, but dozens of others. That's a legacy worth protecting. As the festival concluded, fireworks painted the night sky in brilliant colors that reflected off the irrigation ponds and painted the mountains in brief splendor. Families spread blankets on the courthouse lawn, children chased fireflies, and the community celebrated not just the harvest, but their survival and renewal. The national media attention gradually faded, but the changes in Cedar Valley proved lasting. The community had developed new resilience, new connections, and new systems to protect against future threats. Regional farming cooperatives formed to share resources and information. Legal aid networks were established to help farmers navigate complex financial challenges. Environmental monitoring became a community effort, with regular testing ensuring no repeat of the contamination that had once driven families from their land. Rebecca's role evolved from desperate defendant to community leader. She testified before congressional committees investigating corporate exploitation of rural communities. She spoke at agricultural conferences about recognizing and resisting predatory schemes, but she always returned to Thompson Farm, to the daily rhythms of planting and harvest that had sustained her family for generations. Sophie flourished in the renewed community. Her science fair project on sustainable water management, inspired by the family's ordeal, won state recognition. She spoke confidently about wanting to study environmental law to help other communities fight similar battles. The trauma of nearly losing their home had transformed into purpose and determination. 3 years after the trial, a documentary crew arrived to film the story of Cedar Valley's resistance and recovery. Rebecca walked them through the fields where unauthorized drilling had once threatened the water table, now flourishing with organic crops. She showed them the reinforced community center where farmers still met weekly to share information and support. She introduced them to families who had returned to reclaim their heritage. Marcus Blackwood, interviewed from federal prison, remained unrepentant. He insisted that his only crime was being ahead of his time, that eventually all agricultural land would be valued primarily for its subsurface resources rather than its farming potential. His words served as a chilling reminder of the mindset that had nearly destroyed Cedar Valley, but his prediction proved wrong. The Cedar Valley case had sparked a national movement to protect agricultural communities. States passed laws requiring transparency in land acquisitions and mineral rights negotiations. Federal agencies increased oversight of banking practices affecting rural areas. The notion that farming communities were easy targets for corporate exploitation had been fundamentally challenged. On the 5th anniversary of the courthouse auction, Cedar Valley held a special commemoration. The courthouse steps, where Rebecca had made her desperate stand, now bore a bronze plaque recognizing the community's successful defense of its agricultural heritage. Governor Lawson returned for the dedication, joined by state and federal officials who had participated in the investigation. Rebecca stood with Sophie, now 18 and preparing for college, as they listened to speakers acknowledge the significance of their struggle. The morning fog had lifted, revealing the valley in all its autumn glory. Fields of winter wheat rippled. In the breeze, orchards heavy with fruit promised abundant harvest, and the mountains stood eternal guard over the community that had refused to surrender its birthright. "You know," Sophie said quietly to her mother as the ceremony concluded, "I used to be embarrassed about being a farm kid, about our old truck, our simple life. Now I understand that what we have is priceless, not because of what's under the ground, but because of what grows on top of it and the people who tend it." Rebecca hugged her daughter close, remembering the frightened 12-year-old who had worried about losing their home. "Your dad would be so proud of you, of both of us. We didn't just save the farm, Sophie. We helped save a way of life." As the ceremony dispersed, farmers returned to their daily work with the quiet satisfaction of people who had faced extinction and emerged stronger. The Hendersons were expanding their dairy operation. The Yamamotos had added a farm-to-table restaurant that drew visitors from across the state. Emma Carter's goat cheese had won national awards, bringing recognition to Cedar Valley's agricultural products. That evening, Rebecca sat on her porch as she had countless times before, but now with a deeper appreciation for the view. The setting sun painted the fields in shades of gold that seemed especially rich, especially earned. Her phone buzzed with a text from Governor Lawson. "Watching the sunset from the Capitol, thinking of Cedar Valley and how one community's courage changed everything. Thank you for standing firm when it mattered most." "Patricia," Rebecca typed back, "just a farmer protecting her land. Thank you for showing up when we needed hope. Come visit soon. The apples are especially good this year." Rebecca. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Rebecca reflected on the journey from that desperate morning at the auction to this moment of quiet triumph. The farm was secure, the community was thriving, and Sophie had a future unbounded by fear of losing their heritage. The victory had come at great cost and through enormous struggle, but it had proven that sometimes, when ordinary people stand together for what's right, even the most powerful interests must yield. The night breeze carried the scent of ripening grain and the distant sound of neighbors gathering for evening conversations. Cedar Valley had not just survived, it had become a symbol of successful resistance against corporate overreach. Law students studied the case. Communities facing similar threats drew inspiration from their example, and policymakers cited their struggle when crafting protective legislation. Rebecca smiled as she headed inside, where Sophie was video chatting with friends from other farming communities around the country. They were planning a youth agriculture summit, connecting the next generation of farmers who understood that their heritage was worth fighting for. The Thompson farmhouse glowed warmly in the darkness, a beacon of persistence and hope. 4 generations had worked this land, and now, thanks to the courage of a community that refused to be silenced and the timely intervention of unexpected allies, future generations would have the same opportunity. The story that had begun with one woman's last stand against impossible odds had become something larger, a testament to the power of truth over greed, community over corporate interest, and the enduring value of those who feed the world from soil enriched by generations of care. In Cedar Valley, the harvest would continue, season after season, as it always had and now always would. A decade had passed since the helicopter touched down in Cedar Valley, and the landscape bore witness to a transformation that extended far beyond the legal victories in distant courtrooms. The autumn morning was crisp and clear as Rebecca Thompson stood in the renovated barn that now served as the headquarters for the Cedar Valley Agricultural Cooperative, a farmer-owned organization that had become a model for rural communities across the nation. At 52, Rebecca carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had faced down giants and emerged victorious. Her hair showed strands of silver that caught the morning light as she reviewed quarterly reports showing the cooperative's steady growth. What had started as a defensive alliance against corporate predation had evolved into a thriving economic engine that kept wealth circulating within the community rather than flowing to distant shareholders. Sophie Thompson Chen entered the office carrying her infant daughter Emma, named for the friend who had stood by their side during the darkest days. Now 22 and fresh from completing her environmental law degree at Stanford, Sophie had returned to Cedar Valley with her husband David Chen, a soil scientist she'd met during an agricultural conference. Their decision to settle in the valley represented a reversal of the rural brain drain that had plagued farming communities for generations. "Mom, the delegation from Minnesota just arrived," Sophie said, adjusting Emma on her hip. "They're eager to learn about our water rights protection program." Rebecca smiled at her granddaughter, who gurgled happily and reached for her grandmother's worn farmer's hands. "Tell them we'll start with a tour of the monitoring stations. They need to see the practical application before we dive into the legal framework." The Thompson farm had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for communities facing similar threats. Delegations arrived monthly from across the country and occasionally from overseas, seeking to understand how Cedar Valley had not only survived corporate assault, but emerged stronger and more prosperous than before. Outside, the valley buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible during the foreclosure crisis. The old Peterson Place, once slated for development into luxury condos, now housed the Lawson Center for Rural Justice, named in honor of the governor who had intervened at the crucial moment. Law students and policy researchers worked alongside farmers to develop strategies for protecting agricultural communities from exploitation. The Blackwood name had become synonymous with corporate overreach in business schools and law programs. Marcus Blackwood himself had died in federal prison 5 years into his sentence, a broken man whose empire had crumbled completely. Valley Springs development existed only in case studies and cautionary tales. The mineral rights they had coveted remained safely under the control of the farming families, managed now through a community trust that ensured no single entity could ever again threaten the valley's agricultural heritage. Tom Henley, now in his 80s but still sharp as a tack, served as the elder statesman of the cooperative. His dairy operation had expanded to include an educational component where urban school children learned about sustainable farming. "Never thought I'd see the day when city folks would pay good money to milk cows and collect eggs," he often joked. Though his pride in the program was evident, the Yamamoto family's strawberry farm had become the cornerstone of a thriving agritourism industry. Their success had inspired other farmers to diversify, creating a year-round calendar of activities that drew visitors from across the region. The economic impact rippled through Cedar Valley, supporting new businesses and bringing young families back to the community. Rosa Valdez's diner had expanded into a full restaurant supplied entirely by local farms. Her daughter Maria, who had left for the city years earlier, had returned to help run the business and now served as president of the Cedar Valley Chamber of Commerce. The main street that had once shown signs of decline now featured renovated storefronts, housing artisan shops, a microbrewery, and a farm-to-table culinary school. The weekly farmers' market had grown into a regional destination, with vendors required to source at least 70% of their products from within the valley. The requirement, initially controversial, had spurred innovation in local food processing and value-added products. Cedar Valley honey, preserves, and artisanal cheeses commanded premium prices in urban markets, with profits flowing back to the community. Emma Carter's goat farm had evolved into a teaching facility where aspiring farmers learned sustainable practices. Her partnership with the regional community college had created the first accredited degree program in regenerative agriculture in the state. Students from around the world applied for positions in the program, drawn by Cedar Valley's reputation as a living laboratory for agricultural innovation. The environmental restoration prompted by the lawsuit had yielded unexpected benefits. The cleanup of contaminated sites had led to the discovery of natural springs that now supplied a thriving aquaculture operation. Native plant species, reintroduced as part of the remediation effort, had created habitat corridors that supported increased biodiversity. Birders and naturalists added to the valley's tourism appeal, creating another revenue stream for the community. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had chosen conscience over political expedience during the crisis, had been re-elected twice more before retiring. His replacement, Maria Gonzalez, no relation to the special investigator, was a Cedar Valley native who had left for a career in federal law enforcement before returning home. Her presence symbolized the community's evolution from a place young people fled to, one they actively chose. The Cedar Valley story had inspired federal legislation protecting agricultural communities from predatory practices. The Thompson-Lawson Act, as it came to be known, required transparency in land acquisitions, prohibited certain forms of loan manipulation, and established criminal penalties for deliberate environmental contamination aimed at forcing property sales. Rebecca had testified before Congress during the bill's consideration, her simple eloquence helping to secure bipartisan support. Governor Patricia Lawson had served 2 terms before retiring from politics to lead a national foundation focused on rural economic development. She maintained close ties to Cedar Valley, returning annually for the Harvest Festival that had become a celebration not just of agricultural abundance, but of community resilience. Her keynote address at the previous year's festival had drawn attendees from 12 states. The former Greenfield Regional Bank building now housed the Cedar Valley Credit Union, a member-owned institution that provided fair lending to local farmers and businesses. The credit union's charter specifically prohibited the kind of predatory practices that had nearly destroyed the community. Its success had inspired similar institutions in other agricultural regions, creating a network of community-focused financial alternatives to traditional banking. The mineral deposits that had sparked the entire crisis remained valuable, but their extraction was now governed by strict environmental standards and community oversight. A modest mining operation, majority owned by the cooperative, extracted lithium using cutting-edge techniques that minimized environmental impact. Profits were reinvested in renewable energy projects and agricultural innovation, creating a sustainable economic model that balanced resource extraction with environmental stewardship. Rebecca's leadership of the cooperative had earned national recognition. She had received honorary degrees from 3 universities and served on advisory boards for organizations ranging from the Department of Agriculture to international development agencies. Yet she remained at heart a farmer who found her greatest satisfaction in the cycle of planting and harvest. The Thompson farmhouse had been renovated to accommodate the extended family gatherings that now included Sophie's in-laws and a growing number of grandchildren. The wraparound porch, where Rebecca had once stood in despair, now hosted regular community meetings and celebrations. The kitchen table that had held foreclosure notices now displayed Sophie's law degree, David's soil, science publications and drawings by Emma and her cousins. Technology had transformed farming operations throughout the valley, but the cooperative ensured that innovations served farmers rather than replacing them. Precision agriculture techniques, developed in partnership with agricultural colleges, had increased yields while reducing environmental impact. Drone surveys, soil sensors, and AI-driven crop management systems were tools in service of human wisdom rather than substitutes for it. The cooperative's success had attracted attention from international development organizations. Delegations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America visited to study how Cedar Valley had created economic resilience while preserving cultural heritage. Rebecca found herself consulting on projects aimed at protecting indigenous farming communities from exploitation by multinational corporations. On this particular morning, as Rebecca prepared for the Minnesota delegation's visit, she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end belonged to James Mitchell, former Chief of Staff to Governor Lawson, now serving as Undersecretary for Rural Affairs in the federal government. "Rebecca, I have news that might interest you," Mitchell said. "The President is announcing a national initiative based on the Cedar Valley model. 50 million in grants for communities establishing agricultural cooperatives and land trusts. We're calling it the Thompson-Lawson Rural Resilience Program." Rebecca sank into her office chair, overwhelmed by the implications. A program that had started with her desperate stand at a foreclosure auction was now becoming national policy. The ripples from that morning's events continued to spread in ways she could never have imagined. "James, I don't know what to say. This is incredible. You showed the way, Rebecca. Now other communities will have the tools to protect themselves. The President would like you to be present for the announcement. Will you come to Washington?" After ending the call, Rebecca walked to the window overlooking the valley. The morning mist was lifting, revealing fields that stretched to the mountains. Tractors moved through the rows, their operators members of families who had farmed this land for generations. Children played in schoolyards, their futures secured by the struggles of the past decade. Main Street bustled with activity that spoke of economic vitality rooted in community values. Sophie found her there, baby Emma asleep in her arms. "Mom, the delegation is ready for the tour." Rebecca turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sophie, do you remember that morning at the courthouse when I thought we were going to lose everything? How could I forget? I was terrified. I want you to know something. In that moment, standing there with our pathetic $42,000, I felt like I had failed you, failed your father, failed everyone who came before us. But sometimes our greatest defeats become the foundation for victories we can't imagine." Sophie shifted Emma to one arm and embraced her mother with the other. "You didn't fail anyone, Mom. You stood up when it mattered. You showed all of us what courage looks like." As they headed out to meet the Minnesota delegation, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The community that had once faced destruction now served as a beacon of hope for rural areas worldwide. The farm that had nearly been lost to corporate greed now anchored a thriving agricultural economy. The daughter who had watched her mother's desperate stand now carried forward the legacy with her own family. The delegation consisted of farmers, local officials, and community organizers facing pressure from a corporation seeking to establish large-scale industrial hog operations that threatened their water resources. They had come to Cedar Valley not just for practical advice, but for inspiration, for proof that David could indeed defeat Goliath when communities stood together. As Rebecca began the tour, starting with the restored wetlands that now filtered agricultural runoff naturally. She spoke with the authority of lived experience. The first thing you need to understand is that this isn't just about law or economics. It's about community. Every victory we've achieved started with neighbors supporting neighbors, with people choosing collective benefit over individual gain. The tour wound through the valley, showcasing innovations born from necessity. Solar panels powered irrigation systems. Biodigesters converted agricultural waste into energy. Permaculture gardens demonstrated sustainable food production. At Ida, each stop, community members shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. By afternoon, the delegation gathered in the community center for a detailed presentation on the legal and financial structures that protected Cedar Valley. Sophie led this portion, her legal expertise combined with personal investment creating a powerful narrative. She explained the conservation easements that prevented future development, the cooperative bylaws that ensured democratic decision-making, and the emergency funds that helped farmers weather crises without resorting to predatory loans. The day concluded with a community dinner at Rose's restaurant, where locally sourced food was served family-style and conversations flowed freely between visitors and residents. The Minnesota farmers left with binders full of documents, contact, lists for ongoing support, and most importantly, renewed determination to protect their own communities. As evening settled over Cedar Valley, Rebecca returned to Thompson Farm. Sophie and David were putting Emma to bed in the room that had once been Sophie's childhood sanctuary. The continuity of generations under the same roof spoke to victories deeper than legal triumphs or economic success. Rebecca stepped onto the porch where she had kept so many vigils during the dark days of the foreclosure crisis. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the absence of urban light pollution. In the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of the evening freight train that still stopped at the Cedar Valley grain elevator, now handling the largest shipment volumes in decades. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Lawson. Heard about the national program. Mum would be so proud. Your kindness to her all those years ago started something that just keeps growing. Can't wait to see you in Washington. Patricia. Rebecca typed back. Full circle. Your mother's student becomes a teacher for the nation. Thank you for remembering us when it mattered most. See you soon, Rebecca. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca thought about the speech she would give in Washington. She would talk about the power of community, the importance of preserving agricultural heritage, the need for laws that protected the vulnerable from the predatory. But mostly, she would tell the story of ordinary people who refused to accept defeat, who found strength in unity, and who discovered that sometimes the darkest moments precede the most transformative victories. The Thompson farm stood quiet in the starlight, its fields resting before the next season's planting. 4 generations had worked this soil, and now future generations would have the same opportunity. The legacy was secured not just through legal documents and financial structures, but through the determination of a community that had learned to protect what mattered most. Morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to share the Cedar Valley story with those fighting similar battles. The ripples from that desperate morning at the courthouse continued to spread, touching lives in places Rebecca had never imagined. What had begun as one woman's last stand had become a movement, a model, and ultimately a transformation that proved the enduring power of rooted communities over rootless capital. In her dreams that night, Rebecca saw fields stretching endlessly under sunny skies, worked by generations yet to come. She saw Sophie teaching her own grandchildren about the land, about struggle and triumph, about the morning when everything changed. She saw a valley that had become a symbol of possibility for rural communities everywhere, proof that with courage, unity, and unexpected allies, even the most powerful forces could be turned back. The next phase of their journey was beginning. But the foundation was solid. Cedar Valley had not just survived its crucible, it had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The farm girl who had stood with shaking hands and $42,000 had become a leader whose influence reached far beyond the valley's boundaries. The community that had faced extinction had become a model for regeneration. As dawn approached, bringing another day of purpose and possibility, the land waited patiently as it always had. The soil that had nourished generations would continue its ancient work, supported now by human systems designed to protect rather than exploit. The victory was complete, not because the struggle had ended, but because the means to continue it successfully had been secured for all who would follow. Cedar Valley slept peacefully, its future assured, its story still being written by those who understood that true wealth lay not in what could be extracted from the earth, but in what could be sustained upon it, generation after generation, in harmony with both land and community. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.